Hello, and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name is Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. For those of you who are new, welcome to the community, and for my returning listeners, it's always great to have you back listening to another episode with me. If you are enjoying the show, don't forget to click follow, rate the podcast, whether it's on Apple or Google or wherever, even on YouTube or on Spotify. All of that support really helps me keep the conversation going and allows others to find the show. And you know what? If you feel called to it, you can support what I do here, the episodes I put out, the interviews that I have, the really important conversations that we talk about week in and week out. There is a donation link in my description notes. So if you do, anything is appreciated, but it's never expected. Now, today, I want to talk about a topic that, well, honestly, many of us struggle with at some point. Loneliness versus solitude. It's something we all experience, but often in different ways. And what's the real difference, you might be asking, between being alone and feeling alone? And more importantly, why does it matter, especially when it comes to our relationships or even our emotional well-being? Well, inside of the lifestyle community, these feelings really can take on a more complex form. Sometimes we're surrounded by others at events and scenes online, yet we're completely disconnected from everybody, and maybe we even feel isolated. There are the times when we choose that solitude, taking time alone to reflect, recharge. Just did that this past weekend, right? But that can be just as important for our mental health. Sometimes we just need a couple of, days or hours just to ourselves. Now, when loneliness and solitude shape how we relate to ourselves, to the people around us, and to our partners in the lifestyle, we need to understand how crucial it is to understand these experiences so we can better navigate them and find healthier ways to connect, not just with others, but ourselves. Now, whether you felt the weight of loneliness or you found solace in solitude, today we're going to dive into some of these nuances here and these powerful emotions and why they matter more than you might realize to those of us who live this lifestyle, or even so just in your regular relationships. Now, first, I kind of want to give you all a little bit of a definition of loneliness and solitude so we can better understand it, right? The concepts here of loneliness and solitude are often used interchangeably, but they are fundamentally different. And we need to keep that in mind. And understanding this difference is key, not just for our mental health, but also for our emotional well-being and how we engage in our relationships, especially inside of the BDSM world, right? So first, let's go ahead and start with loneliness. To understand this, it's an emotional state. It's one that's not simply about being physically alone, but about feeling disconnected, isolated. You can feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people. This is a profound sense of not belonging or not being understood. Psychologically, loneliness has been linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and even physical ailments. There was a study done at the University of Chicago that found that chronic loneliness can be as damaging to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I want you to take a moment and just kind of contemplate. You're smoking a 3/4 of a pack of cigarettes a day, and that's just as bad as being lonely. That's how damaging it is to our health. And it's not just a feeling here. It impacts our body, our mind on a physiological level. And when people talk about loneliness, they often refer to that feeling of longing for connection or intimacy that's just isn't being fulfilled. Now, within our community, a person might be surrounded by their friends at an event, or they might be, with people at a scene, or, in an online forum, and they're actively talking to half dozen people. But they can still feel a deep emotional void. This experience of emotional loneliness, despite being surrounded by potential connections, is a significant aspect of mental health, especially in these spaces. It could stem from various things: not feeling understood, right? Not having a partner who shares your needs, or even being in a room full of people, but feeling that no one truly sees you or even hears you. And that's the real damaging effect of this. Loneliness can make us feel small, almost invisible. And in the context of kink, where vulnerability is often at the forefront of what we're doing, feeling emotionally alone can become even more intense. For instance, if you think about Someone who attends a play party but doesn't feel any type of connection, or they're not able to find a partner whose values align with theirs. That loneliness, not the absence of people, but the absence of meaningful connection. That emotional dissonance can heighten the feelings of inadequacy, and it can lead to isolation within that space, and anything that space is supposed to create doesn't manifest for this type of person. Now, on the other hand, solitude is a completely different experience. Solitude isn't about feeling disconnected. It's about choosing to be alone, often for reflection, self-care, personal growth. It's not forced, but it is intentional. It's the peace that comes when you've decided to step away from the noise of the world or the demands of others. Again, a really good example. I've had a really busy couple of weeks, and this past weekend I really wasn't around very much, but I just needed to disconnect. I slept 10 hours, did some light reading, watched a movie, and just focused on me and my recharge. So in that moment, I chose solitude. But there's a lot of us inside of these communities that's, solitude's a necessary act of self-preservation. Maybe even after an intense scene, solitude allows for processing, introspection, and even healing. If you think about this, a submissive might need the time alone to decompress and reflect on what they've just done, what went well, what might need to be discussed, and how their emotional state is shifting. This time alone isn't about isolation, it's about creating a space to reconnect with ourselves, recenter, and ensure that maybe if we are doing aftercare, those needs are addressed. Solitude can really foster a sense of self-discovery, and it allows us to process our own trauma and strengthen our understanding of boundaries. And the difference between loneliness and solitude can sometimes be a blurry line, right? Which is why people often conflate the two. Both involve being alone, but they arise from entirely different emotional experiences. Loneliness is unusually set in a space where we're in this involuntary emotional state that we experience because our need for connection isn't being met. Solitude, on the other hand, it's often a choice. It's an intentional withdrawal from personal reasons, right? Such as emotional reflection or spiritual nourishment. Think of somebody who maybe goes off to takes a vow of silence and becomes a monk, right? They're engaging in solitude, but it's intentional. Both of these things play distinct roles in our mental health. Loneliness can lead to feelings of anxiety and depression. Solitude, on the other hand, has been shown to reduce stress and provide much needed time for self-care. And in fact, psychological studies here have shown that solitude, when actively chosen and engaged with positively, can lead to improvements in creativity, your emotional resilience, and your clarity of thought. Many of the world's greatest thinkers, artists, and leaders intentionally sought solitude, not because it's a retreat from the world, but as a way to connect deeply with themselves and their purpose of the roles they're filling. Now, if we look at and apply this towards the kink community, these concepts take on an even more significant role. There are times when someone may choose solitude to process a scene, to understand their desires more clearly, or even reset emotionally after an intense experience, right? Think about maybe, a particularly intense scene with a dom and a sub and how their session went. The sub might choose solitude to reflect and recharge, right? The dom might need, here on the contrast, might feel isolated or disconnected if the dynamic isn't aligning with their desires or their needs, even if they're physically surrounded by others. This can lead to their loneliness, feeling misunderstood, or even, through their role, they're not truly being seen. And we've seen this time and time again with a lot of people who choose to leave the lifestyle because they think it's not for them, or they're not finding a partner, or they're not understanding a lot of the work, so they don't think they have the ability to perform or perform around others because they're never going to get feedback. They just feel alone. I see a lot of this in therapy where people come to me and talk to me about, I'm feeling lonely. And the problem with loneliness, the other side of this as well, it's a bad motivator. to get things done, right? Because if we're making a lot of choices based on being lonely, then those choices aren't necessarily going to be healthy for us, right? So if we look at these concepts inside of the lifestyle, right, we're talking about we go into our dynamics for deeper connections to be vulnerable, which makes that loneliness sometimes all the more painful when these things don't show up for us. But one thing here, it does offer us an opportunity for growth inside of solitude. Maybe we step back, understand why we're so lonely. So we take some time, a week, two, or maybe a month, or even a few hours, just try to figure out what's driving this emotion. If we can understand, when you need time to be alone and when you're simply feeling disconnected, that becomes really crucial for your emotional health. If you know when solitude can help you reset, you're more likely to return to a scene or your relationship with a clear sense of who you are and what you want. But if you're experiencing loneliness in a lifestyle, it's important to make sure you reach out to talk to somebody, seek a connection, talk to a mentor, talk to somebody who's in your role, talk to someone in your community, find a professional, right? This allows you to create relationships where you feel seen and you're heard and you're understood. And when you recognize the difference between these two emotions, it allows us to navigate all of our world more skillfully. It creates a space for our self-care, our introspection, without letting loneliness spiral into negativity, and any type of self-destructive pattern. It encourages really a healthier, more balanced relationship with ourselves, whether within kink or the community and any part of our lives, when we're taking a step back from loneliness and engaging in the solitude so we can understand ourselves, understand our world. I know it's a fine line, and I kind of bounce between the two because I want you to understand they're not the same thing, right? So I want to focus here a little bit now on loneliness, because when we talk about loneliness really inside of our community, it is truly a nuanced experience. It's really niche because it gets intensified by the very nature of our dynamics that define our lifestyle. Because it's easy here to assume that within the community that emphasizes vulnerability, connection, depth, loneliness wouldn't be such a frequent struggle for people, but the opposite really can be true, especially when people are involved in scenes or relationships that don't fully meet their emotional needs, or, when they feel disconnected despite being surrounded by other people. Now, some of you might be asking, how does loneliness manifest inside of our lifestyle communities? Well, it takes a lot. Loneliness really does take on a lot of different forms, and it's not always about being physically alone. I actually remember times when I've gone to friends' parties, and I was the single guy, and you would see people loved up and coupled up, and all of a sudden it kind of amplifies that feeling of loneliness, and my God, is there something wrong with me? And I'll date anyone at that point, right? And all of these things we look at it, and it's the same thing when I've gone to dungeons. I've seen it, whether I've had a submissive or I've gone alone, and those thoughts and feelings kind of creep in, right? Sometimes people experience all of these different kinds of emotional isolation, even in the presence of other people. It doesn't mean that, this isn't just going to happen because we have a connection and it's meaningful with our partners. We can still feel alone because we don't know how to talk about what's going on inside of us. And we're keeping a lot of our interactions surface level. And when we look at our community in a space that really values being authentic and creating connections, it can really be painful to someone who's lonely because it feels like, hey, I don't fit in here. It doesn't feel like I'm understood. And we don't know how to talk about that. We don't know the language to say to get that to come across. But let's look a little bit here. Look at this example, right? Let's say someone goes to a play party and engages with people throughout the evening. They're talking, they're chatting, shaking hands, asking questions, observing, right? They may have these meaningful conversations. They might participate in stuff and they might even interact. But at the end of the night, they still feel disconnected and alone. And this is the kind of loneliness that isn't based on some sort of physical isolation here, but really that emotional disconnection. Maybe they're feeling that the interactions they had were just shallow and no one understands them. And a lot of the times, this leads to feelings of being invisible or sometimes questioning your own self-worth within the community. And in some cases, people may also experience loneliness within a relationship themselves, like I was talking about before. A submissive might feel maybe in a dynamic where their emotional needs aren't being met, or the dominant partner, they might feel isolated because their expectations of connection, engagement aren't being fulfilled. The power exchange at the core of our relationships can often create a dynamic where emotional intimacy is difficult to navigate for people, especially if the emotional needs of one or both partners aren't aligned within the structure of the relationship itself. And that's problematic. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it if we're not talking about it, if we're not communicating our needs, right? And this sometimes leaves people feeling unseen, misunderstood, unimportant, despite being in a relationship or despite being part of some sort of community within the global arena. But here, the impact of loneliness on our mental health and relationships really takes effect, because the effect of loneliness inside of the larger community, vanilla world, and our kink community, it's not just emotional, but it can impact our mental health in significant ways. Like I mentioned to you before, prolonged loneliness, particularly when it's tied to feeling disconnected in intimate settings, can lead to inadequacy, self-doubt, sometimes depression. If someone is consistently unable to find partners who align with their desires, or who are unable to emotionally connect with somebody, it can lead to failure. They feel like they're never good enough, or even frustration. And this can erode somebody's sense of self-worth. And it can lead somebody to withdraw, especially from the community. Now, I do want to make a point here, though. It's not that our job to make somebody feel not alone. We can only work within the parameters of what we know and what we understand. We are not here, no one's here, not even me. I can't make sure everyone's okay, because if they're not doing their part and letting us know, hey, I'm noticed all of you here are just into, impact and heavy sadism, but no one's into rope. But I like being around you guys, but I just don't feel connected. Well, maybe we can understand that, and maybe we can then, at that point as a community, help them find people that are into something that they enjoy, so they don't withdraw from the community, and they see that the resilience inside of a community that rallies around them. Right? Now, I realize that might be a little bit of a utopian thought, but that's kind of what we're supposed to do. Now, here's another thing that we don't talk about, but sometimes can really be exacerbated by loneliness, and that's jealousy. Because when someone feels disconnected or excluded, they may become envious of those who seem to have connections they want. And in some cases, this jealousy can even bleed into their own relationships. It causes a lot of unnecessary tension or drama. And we have to really understand that jealousy in the kink world isn't about possession, but rather a reflection of unmet needs or fears of being overlooked or undervalued. And when we consider our dynamics here, where vulnerability is definitely at the forefront of a lot of what we're doing, loneliness can create a barrier to that emotional intimacy. You're just going to show up, do your thing, and leave. There's no real, it's transactional almost. If someone feels alone within the scene or their relationship, they're going to probably withdraw emotionally. And that's going to disrupt that whole flow of trust and communication. So if you think about maybe a submissive here who feels emotionally unsupported by their dominant, they might close off. And that's going to impact the dynamic and the quality of the exchange. And if a dom is struggling with that loneliness, they might feel that they're carrying, all that emotional weight of the relationship without receiving anything in return. Now, we talk about these things, but, I get the common question, Chris, well, what do we do? How do we kind of work and channel through this? Well, we need to understand there are strategies for coping with loneliness for what we do inside of the community or just in the greater vanilla world that we all inhabit. So I want to talk about a few of these things. I've got a few points here I want to go over. So first, I want to make sure that you really are building something authentic. And that's how you address loneliness. because you want to put in effort, you want to be genuine, and you want to make sure that it's reciprocal. So you got to move beyond surface level interactions when you engage with people, right? This helps you get past all of that and promote some sort of form of emotional intimacy, right? It doesn't matter if it's a scene or a discussion that's a little bit more, maybe something in a casual setting. But no matter, you have to just, maybe here's something, and I do this in therapy, you can do. It's not, it's not a therapeutic practice, but I call it the 10% rule. If you show up to a munch or you go to a dungeon and you're like, God, it's the third or fourth time I've been here. I'm giving this 20 minutes. I'm going to go. Stay for 10% longer. One more question. Maybe once you get past that point, because if you've always been leaving at the 20-minute mark, maybe at 22 minutes, somebody's going to talk about something that interests you, and you're going to be glad you stayed. I know that's happened to me before. A lot of times it's happened to me, right? I worked in DC for a while, and I'd go and listen to people, generals or whoever was releasing some book on strategy or terrorism or whatever the case may be, and I'd go and I'm like, oh God, this is just another boring discussion. But I would always initiate the 10% rule. I'll stay 10% longer, right? If it's an hour, I'll stay for an hour and 10 minutes. First, I don't want to be rude because, this is somebody else's moment to shine, and I don't want to take away from that. And getting up and leaving, that's a distraction, right? But what we're doing is allowing ourselves to engage. Second, don't forget about the power of a support network, right? There's numerous ways to find like-minded people who share all of our interests and our experiences. There's hundreds of forums online. There is places like Facebook, Fetlife, Instagram, Twitter. You can find your people. Look inside of your town where you live. And if there's nothing, maybe consider starting something. Or you might have to travel a little bit. And if that's not in your budget, then you're going to have to work at it. A lot of this is going to depend on how much you want it, right? Because no one's just going to show up and throw a dungeon in your backyard and do it for free. It's not how the world works. You have to put in some effort defining your people, right? The next step here I want to talk about is focusing on a little bit of self-love and self-awareness. If we understand now that loneliness is a reflection of unmet needs, this becomes an opportunity to reconnect with who you are. So you need to do some quiet introspection, some self-care, right? A little bit of growth to understand who you truly are. I do this with my clients. When we're done with having a session, and any of them who listen to my show are going to be nodding their heads right now, I tell them all, you get an hour off. You've been thinking about whatever we've talked about all night, all day. You're done. Go do some you time, play a game, take a shower, go for a run, eat some food, make some whatever. Do something, right? A little bit of self-love, self-care. If you make some progress, you treat yourself, right? You had a good week at work. You sold more than everybody else. Take yourself out. Go to a nice dinner. Go see that movie you wanted to see. It doesn't matter if you don't have anybody. Go by yourself. You're reminding yourself how important you are, right? The fourth thing here is exploring new forms of connection, because sometimes the solution to loneliness in the kink community is exploring different types of relationships or dynamics that may not necessarily be tied to kink, right? There's a place called meetup.com. It's global. You can find people who want to swim, want to hike, do macrame, clay pottery, poetry, all of it, playing chess, singles groups that, yes, they're not necessarily tied to the kink community, but you can find people. Our lives, even my life, doesn't revolve around the lifestyle. The lifestyle revolves around me, so it fits into my life, right? So I have other interests, believe it or not, outside of kink, right? So we have to do all of these things. And lastly, communication and transparency. I know every time I say communication, I'm a broken record, but it's truly key inside of a relationship, because if you're not talking, I don't know how long someone's going to hang out with you if you're just, a tight-lipped like turtle and say nothing. I'm going to give somebody about 30 seconds if you're not responding to them to get up and just pretty much leave, right? But why is this so important when you're lonely? Because if you can learn to communicate how you're feeling open and honestly with somebody, this, number one, it prevents a misunderstanding, prevents somebody thinking you're being an asshole or standoffish, right? When that's absolutely not the case. It allows you to be connected. It allows you to find support. The bigger, you really have to understand this impacts a lot of what we do. Because loneliness in the kink community can really feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be a permanent state or a prison sentence. You have to first recognize it, second, be honest with yourself, and then understand how you feel. Because if you're disconnected or alone, don't ignore it. You have to acknowledge it. Because from there, it's about finding the right people and building the relationships that actually fulfill you. But that's not just on them. That's also on you. And you have to understand that. Here, communication, more than anything else, is key. Because you need to talk about how you're feeling and what's going on, because then that way they're going to understand, wow, John's really not an asshole because he doesn't say anything. He's just doesn't know where he fits. God, that makes a lot of sense. Now I understand why he's been so quiet. Or maybe Michelle over there, who seems reserved and timid, she's just been feeling lonely. She doesn't know if the community is part of her. Makes sense. We've all been there, right? So we allows other people to engage with us too. But no matter what, you're not alone. Just because you're feeling lonely, it doesn't make you alone. It's part of being human. It doesn't mean you have to settle for being stuck in that space. You got to reach out. You have to get clear on what you need, and you have to make sure you're creating the kind of connections that actually help you feeling seen, heard, and even understood. The last thing I want to do, the final point on solitude, I really kind of want to talk about, because there's actually more benefits to solitude. Because when we think of this word, we often imagine, again, isolation. I'm up on the mountain, or I'm deep in the woods, or wherever I'm going to be at, because we're cut off from others. But the truth is, solitude is really a powerful tool for personal growth, especially if you're in a lifestyle. And we really haven't embraced that yet. I don't think people understand the power of solitude. Because here, I can sit in solitude, and I can think about the vulnerability of myself, the dynamics that I'm in, the scenes I've done. I can create better boundaries when I have some quiet time, or I can explore my own emotional depth, because that's paramount to who I am as a person. And solitude provides that space to connect not just with others, but myself, especially in a way that's essential for emotional well-being and our own personal development. We often forget that. We let that go, right? It is a positive thing because we reflect, we recharge, we process how we feel, especially after something intense has gone down, right? Or, we have to understand that just because we're taking some time for ourselves, it's not about we're avoiding others or we're rejecting people. It's about taking that space to heal, reset, become more grounded, more aware. And we need to understand any of these positive aspects of solitude go beyond just being alone. It's about choosing to be alone in order to reflect on our experiences, our desires, our needs. I get a lot of emails from people talking to me about, I took some time off this weekend. It just felt amazing. I slept in, I made some pancakes and bacon, and I binged watched something all weekend, and I just feel better. Absolutely, 100%. Because it's in that moment of solitude you grow stronger. You get the chance to understand yourself. You recharge. Maybe you are going to start being able to appreciate or approach your relationship from a place that's clear and authentic. And that's so much of what we need inside of the lifestyle. We need to understand here that solitude and understanding our desires and boundaries go hand in hand. And it's such an empowering aspect, right? Because when we're constantly interacting with other people, engaging in these scenes, or figuring out how our relationships are working, it's easy to lose touch with what you truly need or want. Solitude gives you the time to sit with those thoughts and reflect and work on what's important to you, what's what parts are good for you and what parts aren't working for you. Now, none of that's done without communication. I'm not telling you to go take a 30-day monk stay and not tell anybody. I'm not saying that. You want to communicate. I'm going to take some time for myself, right? I'm just going to take time. I'm going to recharge the batteries. I'll talk to you, Monday. Or I'll talk to you Saturday afternoon. I see this with couples sometimes, especially if one partner is anxiously attached and they're constantly clinging on. It starts draining. I talked about this during my Emotional Vampires a little bit, my episode on that a couple of weeks ago, right? People start draining us, and then the other partner doesn't know what to do, and the only way they're going to get recharged is by some alone time. And that's a really hard conversation to have, because then the other person's feeling rejected. You're not responsible for how they feel. You're only responsible for how you feel and how you communicate, right? One thing I've learned, especially in my role of dealing and working in the trauma field, is that it allows us a lot of healing and processing time for our trauma. We have to understand that, if a scene brings up memories of a past trauma, solitude does give us the necessary time to reflect and process how we're feeling without rushing through them. It allows us to respect our feelings without the distraction of others' needs or the immediate pressure to engage. Solitude can become a form of emotional self-care here for us. It allows us to hit that reset button before re-entering the world or even the community, right? It allows you to engage with other people so, you're doing well for yourself. You're doing so from a place of strength, not reaction. Healing in solitude doesn't mean you're shutting off from the world and avoiding connection entirely. It just means you're giving yourself the space that, to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable with yourself first. It's about honoring our own emotional journey and using solitude to regain clarity before you share that journey with others. And a lot of times, and I've talked about some of my own struggles with trauma. It's why I understand it. I've talked about assault. And sometimes, I have bad days where these memories re-enter my mind. So I need, if I've had a long day or if I have a little bit of a quieter week, I can take some time. I go to the gym, I go for a nice long walk, and I walk down to the water, or walk down to the beach, and I just sit with my thoughts. I reconnect. I listen to the world, might see some birds or a pelican or whatever else is going on, and then I come back home and I just feel better. But it takes time, and like anything else, it takes practice. So don't be so hard on yourself if you're not getting it right the first time, because then you're just reinforcing the notion that negativity is all you deserve, and you don't. Now, how do we incorporate solitude in some of our healthier aspects of the lifestyle? Well, that's an easy one. I've got a few easy tips for you here. Setting boundaries. I talk about this all the time. Most of the time when I respond to people, I'm always talking to them. You're talking about setting healthy boundaries. And on top of that, you got to set healthy boundaries around your alone time, right? Second, you got to engage in some solo self-care practices, right? Meditation, journaling, like I do, taking a walk, engage in something creative. It's been a while, but I really love to paint. Whether you all know that about me or not, I used to paint quite a bit, and I kind of got good at it. I mean, I'm not a Picasso or anything like that, but I could do. It was a really cathartic way and a really engaging way for me to relax, right? Third step here, or third tip, use solitude to reflect on your experiences. Maybe take the time after a scene to sit with that experience and reflect on what it means to you, how you feel about it. Did it deepen a connection? All of these things. And finally, don't feel guilty for needing any alone time. We don't have to justify wanting time to recharge to anyone. We often get caught in this trap where we are wanting some time for ourselves, and then all of a sudden what ends up happening is that somebody says, oh, you've taken too much time away, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Well, then you know what? That's a manipulation tactic. They're telling us, you know what, we're not allowed to be on our own time schedule, we have to be on theirs. Well, that's fine. If that's what they want, I don't care. if they've got, an 8-pack set of abs, or they've got the perfect behind with the perkiest boobs, or whatever, or they're submissive of your dreams, or the dom of your dreams. If they're pressing you like that, that's not the person for you, because that becomes the first indicator that over time, anytime you want some solitude to reflect and recharge, you're not going to be allowed to have it, or they're going to guilt you, and that's not going to be healthy. Now, it's really clear that we understand here the difference between loneliness and solitude. I'm hoping you've all gained a little bit of an understanding here, because it's not just about labeling our emotions, but about learning how to navigate them in the ways that support our emotional growth and our well-being. Loneliness and solitude do play important roles in how we exchange and how we engage in our relationships with ourselves and with other people. Loneliness might keep us from, getting into a deeper connection with someone or with others, because we haven't figured out what our own emotional needs are. But the great part is solitude gives us that space to reflect and grow and connect intentionally and understand what we want inside of these things. And I really want you all to kind of think about, maybe reflect on your own experiences here between loneliness and solitude. Are there any moments where you've kind of felt emotionally disconnected or even surrounded by people? Or perhaps there's some times when you've given up on that clarity, right? You said, screw it, this is just me. But I don't know, maybe you found solitude in that moment, and you came back, you're like, I'm recharged, I've got some boundaries, I understand myself a little bit deeper. Take a moment to consider how you might create a more meaningful connection, first with yourselves and then others as you move forward. Whether it's carving time for that reflection, engaging in some deeper conversations with people you really have been putting off, or just simply being more intentional about who you connect with. This whole process of self-awareness and connection is an ongoing thing. Now, what I want to talk about real quick is I've got some upcoming shows. I do have a couple of interviews. I still have an interview I want to do out of the Middle East. I want to talk more. Somebody had connected with me about, after I did my show last year, about BDSM in the Middle East. There is a dominant there. The more we've talked, the more interesting it's going on, and they're part of our global community, and I think it's an important discussion to have. So that's going to be coming forward. I still have an interview to do with, I believe she's Red Leather One, but I can't recall her name right now, but she's up in Wisconsin. She's really into the leather community. It's got a lot to say about her journeys, and she writes about mental health, and she talks about the community. She's really passionate. She's going to come on the show. If you haven't had a chance to listen, a couple of weeks ago, I sat down and I interviewed John Baku, the owner of Fetlife, but it wasn't about the platform. It was about the man behind it. And I hope you get a chance to listen to that, because it's a really important episode. I think you actually start to learn who the man is and the things that he goes through, what he's actually fighting for a lot of the people that inhabit the place that he created, and the toll it takes on him. And it's quite interesting. I learned a lot about him, right? If you do have any questions, or there are any episodes or any shows you'd like me to look into, or maybe do something for you, absolutely send me an email, thekinkperspective@gmail.com. I'll get that, take a look at it, and I'll always respond. I respond to everybody who gets a hold of me. If you didn't know, and I really appreciate a friend of mine giving me some polite encouragement, I do have a book. It's called Tangled Desires, the intersection between BDSM and psychology. First, I will admit, it's my first book. I've never written anything before. I wrote a book a couple of years ago. It is a little repetitive. It is a little bit analytical, right? I spent a lot of time writing it, but you can get it wherever you download books. It's like on Kindle if you get one an electronic book, or you can order a hard copy version of it. All right? But if you don't like it, tell me about it. If I write something again in the future, I'll take that into consideration. But just keep in mind, it's the first time I did something like that. But it is available there. It is for kind of some first timer. It really does help you about how you start navigating the community and other things that you experience. but I think a lot of it was I was trying to drive certain points home. So let me know what you thought about the show today, how this maybe impacts you, right? How, if you understand loneliness, if you experienced it, if you've spent a lot more time in solitude, and what that really means to you, right? Just keep the discussion going. You can get a hold of me on Instagram, Fetlife. I'll put up my handle, or X, any of those spaces. But let's really keep talking about it, because I think this is something in the community that a lot of people, we don't know they're experiencing this, especially loneliness. And maybe it gives us a way to, again, when we talk about being a community, to keep people in the folds and to keep them from not feeling this way. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kink.